It's a highway to heaven. None can walk up there but the pure in heart. It's a highway to heaven. I am walking up the King's highway.
There's no way to talk about the storefront church and its emergence and development without talking about the Great Migration. Because in fact, it happens in the context of people moving from the South to the urban North. And I believe wanting to have a place where they can recreate some of their Southern experiences. And at the same time, recreate their spiritual homes. Now, what's interesting about it is that in the storefront church, people recreate the experience of being together in faith, but they do it with a little bit of courage, shall we say. And so it happens as part of the Great Migration, and it happens as an experience in experimenting with one's spirituality. And I think also experimenting with leadership, because maybe back home they were just members of their hometown Baptist church. But here in this northern city of Philadelphia, they get to be founding members. They begin to take on roles that they may not have ever taken back home. So it's a growing experience, and it's experimentation. This very issue of the representation of storefront churches is why I wrote the book. Having grown up in one, I was also keenly aware of how we were written about. Not just by everyday people who called us holy rollers, but also scholars who should know better, in my opinion, but who reduced us to basically people who had a lot of stress because we were poor or we were oppressed, and all we could really do was get into these little storefronts and holler and scream and roll on the floor. And I knew there was more to us than that, and I guess somewhere early on in my life I decided I would have to provide an alternative understanding. I believe that the scholarship that I do is innately driven by a desire to give voice to those who are often silenced. Generally, there's been a dichotomy. I think it's a false binary opposition that's made towards the established mainstream Black independent churches and the little storefronts. The storefronts are thought of as being insular, otherworldly, self-serving only, and the established churches have been institutionalized enough that they can be part of the larger world and issues in the larger society. I believe that that dichotomy is a false one. I say that because the local is always part of something large, even in a church which was as insular as mine, intentionally as insular as mine was, because you don't teach young people, for example, that education is important without affecting their lives, the lives of their community, the lives of the children they're going to produce, the people that they interact with. The kind of effect that these larger churches wanted to have on the Black community was what we were doing on a day-to-day basis, not through policy, not through programs, but by the way we reformulated and transformed our lives.
If you're not walking, start while I'm talking.
Music in the storefront church experiences, I've tried to explore it in my book, is part of a larger story. It's part of a spirituality that I believe has at least two sources. One is African spirituality, and the other one is revivalism in the Euro-Americanism, in Euro-American religion. Let me try to break that down. If we look at spirituality in West Africa, we're looking at the embodiment of spirit. Spirit is not an abstract notion. It is something that fills you, okay? You are possessed by the gods, okay? And you feel that, and that's part of your understanding of divinity. I know it's a bit of a generalization, but it describes what is common to West African spirituality. That, I believe, was reinforced selectively by Euro-American revivalism. So I'm not saying this is just African culture that's survived all this time. I'm saying it has been reinforced by what it met here. Was around the time, in the next 100, 200 years, was the time of the Great Awakenings, okay? And that was a time in which Protestantism was infused with this enthusiasm, this revivalism, this emphasis on the personal experience, on personal piety, and on feeling the Spirit. and there was an expression of the Spirit. These were Europeans who came with this. And so you have this conflation of European spirituality, emphasis on spirit, let's call it spirit privileging, intersecting with African spirit privileging, and I believe coming together in a very rich mix of embodied faith. Music is that which bolsters and promotes and continues and keeps that experience sustained over time. When we think about gender in storefront churches, particularly storefront holiness Pentecostal churches or sanctified churches, we need to keep in mind that these are churches in which spirit trumps everything. Revelation is a major, not the only, but a major source of knowledge. If a woman, let us say at the time, let's say in the early 1900s, wanted to be a minister in many established black churches, she was kidding herself. Let me give you an example. The founder of my church grew up Baptist in Mecklenburg, Virginia. And she told me that she had a call. And she went to the men of her church and told them that she'd been called to preach. And they told her, God never called a woman to preach. But she goes to Philadelphia, and it's a place of many things, including anonymity. And she began to move with people who were Pentecostal holiness people, sanctified people, who understood that the call really did not have gender dimensions, that the call was the call. Now, some of these churches also had their limitations in terms of gender, but you were much more likely to be able to be a female and to be a minister and to head a church if you were in a Pentecostal holiness tradition, a sanctified church, in which your call was given validity not by education, not by the vestry board, but by your relationship to God and by revelation of a very personal nature. In the church that I write about, people were able to define themselves in ways that went beyond the way society did. Society ascribed most of them as poor, black, uneducated people, because that's the way society does that, and those are the characteristics that society tends to focus on, particularly when looking at black people at that time. They negotiated a great deal of structural racism in the marketplace, in employment, and in housing. They knew themselves to be expendable in the larger society, but in the church, they were children of God. They were ministers of the word. They were those who spoke in tongues. God fills you with God's Spirit. That's pretty high. You know, it's a pretty high level of existence when you contain divinity. So society may define you one way, but you know yourself another. The constant of the church in the life of African Americans, I believe, has to do with the fact that it is both spiritual and it is also institutional. One is able to determine one's spirituality in terms of the traditions that have been passed on to you because it is your church, because you're the one who sets the program. You're the one who determines the beliefs and the values. It's not coming from the outside. You control the institution, its structure, processes, its beliefs and practices, its content. It's going to change. Nothing stays static, but it's according to your own terms. I don't know of any other institution in which black people have that kind of control of an institutional nature. I simply don't. I think that requires those who are heads of churches to be terribly responsible, because it is, in many cases, the only game in town in which we have the final say. I hope it will stay current so that it can continue to provide this institutional, shall we say, power unit, both spiritual power and political social power that we need.